She flew 10,000 miles to meet his family. She landed to find another woman already wearing his ring. No warning, no apology, no explanation. Just a beautiful stranger walking through those doors with diamonds on her finger and a name that meant promised. Zuri Bennett had given up everything for this man. Her career, her city, her sense of safety. And standing in that marble foyer in Seoul, surrounded by people who spoke a language she was still learning, she realized she might have given it all up for a lie. If you've ever loved someone who wasn't fully yours, stay with me. Like this story and drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this one travels. The flight from Chicago to Seoul was 14 hours and 20 minutes, and Zuri counted most of them. Not because she was afraid of flying. She'd crossed oceans before. London for a conference, Dubai for a competition, Tokyo for a joint urban planning summit, where she'd been the youngest presenter and one of 3 black women in a room of 200. She knew how to be alone in a foreign space. She'd built a career on it, but this was different. This wasn't a conference. This wasn't professional territory where her portfolio could speak for her and her credentials could clear a room. This was a family. A specific family with specific expectations in a country she had been studying for 8 months, like a woman preparing for a final exam that would determine the rest of her life. She had the language workbooks. She had the etiquette guides, the cultural primers, 3 conversations with a Korean-American colleague who'd warned her, gently but firmly, that no amount of preparation would be enough. She had a notebook filled with phonetic approximations of phrases she wanted to use, greetings for elders, expressions of gratitude, the correct way to receive something with both hands. She'd practiced the bow depth with her bathroom mirror at 2 in the morning because she couldn't sleep, and because getting it wrong felt like a catastrophe she refused to risk. She was 24 years old. She had a master's degree from one of the best architecture programs in the country, and she was terrified. Not of the family, not exactly. She was terrified of wanting something this much. Zuri leaned her head against the oval window and watched the clouds break over the Pacific, that endless silver nothing below the plane, and she thought about the first time she'd seen Kang Tae-hyun. Not the way she usually replayed it, softened, edited, stripped of the parts that embarrassed her. She let herself remember it the real way. A waterfront development summit in Boston, 18 months ago. She'd been presenting her urban integration proposal for the Chicago Lakefront redevelopment project, a 40-slide deck she'd rebuilt 4 times in 2 weeks because nothing felt right, and she'd been running on 3 hours of sleep and a gas station coffee that had gone cold in her hand. She'd walked to the podium, looked out at the audience, and immediately spotted the man in the second row who was watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not bored, not skeptical, not the particular brand of polite indifference she'd learned to expect when she walked into rooms where she was the youngest, the only, or both. He was paying attention, actually paying attention, in the way that made the back of her neck prickle. She'd given the presentation anyway. She was a professional. But she'd been aware of him the whole time, aware of the slight forward tilt of his posture, the way he held his pen without writing anything, the quality of his stillness. Kang Tae-hyun. She'd learned his name from the conference program during the coffee break. Korean, 29. Senior executive of Kang Global Development, one of those enormous, quietly powerful conglomerates she'd seen mentioned in international construction journals, but never paid much attention to. He was in Boston for 2 days before flying back to Seoul. He'd found her at the reception that evening and said without preamble, "Your analysis of load distribution in tidal zones was the most practical thing I've heard all week. Not beautiful presentation, not great work for someone your age, not any of the 1,000 slightly condescending things she'd learned to deflect with a practiced smile. Practical. Like it was the highest compliment he knew how to give." She'd said, "The previous 3 proposals all ignored the sediment variability data. I don't understand how you ignore the sediment data." He'd said, "Neither do I." And that had been that. 14 months of long-distance calls that started as professional consultations and became something else, so gradually she hadn't noticed the exact moment of transition. Visits. Him to Chicago twice, her to Seoul once, a week in Tokyo that existed in a category of its own. Tae-hyun was not easy company. He was quiet in ways that could feel like disapproval, until she learned to read the difference between his thinking silence and his closed silence. The small muscle along his jaw that moved when he was choosing his words carefully, the particular way he set down his glass when something bothered him. He didn't explain himself often. He expected people to pay attention, and he paid attention back, and that reciprocity had felt like the most intimate thing she'd ever experienced. He'd proposed in her apartment in Chicago. No restaurant, no audience, no performance. Just the two of them sitting on her kitchen floor at midnight with takeout containers between them because neither of them had wanted to stop talking long enough to eat at the table like normal people. He'd said, "I want to stop doing this from a distance. I want you in my life in a way that's real." And then he'd put a ring on her finger that was simple and exactly right, and she'd said yes before he'd finished the sentence. She hadn't known then everything that yes would require of her. The fasten seatbelt sign blinked on. Below the plane, the first edges of the Korean peninsula appeared through breaking cloud cover. Coastline, then land, then the sprawl of a city that didn't belong to her yet. Zuri pressed her palm flat against the window glass. "Pay attention," she told herself. "That's all. Just pay attention." So, Incheon International was enormous and efficient, and she cleared customs in 40 minutes, which was faster than she'd cleared O'Hare last spring. The Kang family had sent a car, a black SUV, tinted windows, a driver who met her at the arrivals exit with a small sign that read Bennett in clean block letters. He was maybe 50, compact and serious, and he gave her a bow and took her bags without speaking. His name was Mr. Park. He told her this in careful English and then focused entirely on navigating them out of the airport complex. The drive to the Kang estate took 90 minutes, out of Seoul proper, into the mountains north of the city, through gates that appeared with increasing frequency on the private road until the final ones, heavy iron, embedded cameras, 2 guards who checked the vehicle and stepped aside without warmth or conversation. The estate sat behind those gates like something from a different century, all traditional Korean architecture scaled up to a dimension that communicated power without trying. Zuri had seen photographs. She had not been prepared for the weight of the actual thing. Stone walls, mature trees, silence of a particular quality, the kind that came not from emptiness but from discipline. Everything here was intentional. Everything here had been chosen. She thought about the suitcases in the trunk, her clothes, her portfolio, her books, her life compressed into luggage. And something tightened in her chest that she refused to name as doubt. The front doors were open. A woman stood in the entry. 40s, impeccably dressed, posture like architecture. And Zuri recognized Kang Ji-soo, Tae-hyun's mother, from the photographs he'd shown on her. Beside Ji-soo was a teenager with loose hair and impatient energy who had to be Soo-yeon, his younger sister. Behind them, seated in a carved wooden chair near the inner corridor, an elderly woman in a traditional hanbok who had not risen but whose eyes were already moving across Zuri with an attention that felt like measurement. The grandmother, Park Myung-ja-tae, Ha-yeon, had told her about each of them. The mother who managed the family's public philanthropy with an iron precision and had wanted him to marry 10 years ago. The sister who was 17 and impossible, and the only member of the family who regularly made him laugh. The grandmother who had buried a husband, outlasted a dynasty, and whose opinion, he'd said quietly, meant more to him than anything. "She will see you clearly," he'd said. "Don't try to manage that, just let her." Zuri stepped out of the SUV and bowed. She got the depth right. She knew she did because she'd practiced it 800 times in her bathroom mirror. Jisoo descended the steps and offered her hands. Not a handshake, but a gesture of reception that Zuri returned correctly, and she watched something in the woman's expression recalibrate. Not warmth, not yet, but the particular shift of someone revising a preliminary judgment. Soo-yeon bounced forward and said in accented but confident English, "You're taller than I thought," and grinned when Zuri laughed. The grandmother said nothing, just watched. Tae-hyun appeared in the doorway behind his mother, and for a moment the entire arrival, the stone walls, the guards, the weight of everything she didn't know, fell away, and Zuri felt only the particular relief of a familiar face. He came down the steps and took both her hands, and the tension in her shoulders dropped 2 inches. "You look tired," he said. 14 hours, she said. "Come inside." The estate was more beautiful on the interior than she'd expected. It shouldn't have surprised her. She was an architect. She understood how structures could deceive from outside. But the proportions were exceptional. Whoever had designed the interior renovations had understood that traditional Korean spatial philosophy and modern livability were not contradictions. The corridors moved light the way she'd only seen in intentionally designed buildings. The courtyard, glimpsed through a set of lacquered doors, held a garden that was clearly decades old and maintained with the kind of patient discipline that told her something about this family she hadn't already known. She was given a room in the east wing, private, quiet, a window overlooking a section of the courtyard garden. It was more than she'd expected, and she took that as a sign of something. She showered, changed, and was sitting on the edge of the bed with her notebook open when Su-yeon appeared in the doorway. "Can I come in?" "Sure." The girl sat cross-legged on the low table near the window and looked at her with the direct assessment of someone who hadn't yet learned to disguise her curiosity as indifference. "My brother never brings anyone home. Like, ever. My mother had basically given up." "Given up on what?" "On him choosing." Su-yeon said it flatly, matter-of-factly, the way teenagers said things that adults had been carefully managing for years. "He does what he wants. He's always done what he wants. It used to drive my father insane." Zuri watched her. "And your mother?" "She pretends she's okay with whatever. She's not." The girl shrugged. "She'll be okay with you, though. She thinks you're serious. I can tell she thinks that. It's different when she thinks someone is serious." "What does serious look like to her?" Su-yeon thought about it. "She watched you bow when you got out of the car. She watched your hands when you greeted her. She notices everything. She just doesn't say it. You know the expression nunchi? The awareness of atmosphere. Reading what isn't spoken." Su-yeon blinked. "Yeah, exactly. She has a lot of it. So does my brother." A pause. "So do you, I think." Zuri said, "I've been practicing." "It's not something you practice," Su-yeon said. "That's kind of the point." Dinner that first night was the family only. Tae-hyun, his mother, his sister, and the grandmother, who sat at the head of the table and ate slowly and said very little. The food was prepared by a household staff Zuri hadn't been introduced to yet, and it was extraordinary, the kind of meal that communicated effort as a form of communication. Jisoo asked her careful questions in near-fluent English, about her work, her education, her family in Chicago. Zuri answered directly, without embellishment. Her father was an electrical engineer, her mother taught middle school English. She was the eldest of 3. She'd known she wanted to be an architect since she was 9 years old, and her mother had taken her to see a Frank Lloyd Wright house in Oak Park. Jisoo said, "It is unusual, in your country, for a woman your age to specialize in waterfront infrastructure." "It's unusual in any country," Zuri said. "That's part of why I did it." Tae-hyun said nothing, but she caught the small shift at the corner of his mouth. The grandmother had been watching Zuri throughout the meal with that same measuring quality she'd had in the entryway. At the end of dinner, she said something in Korean, and Tae-hyun translated without inflection. "She says you eat like someone who respects food." Zuri looked at the grandmother directly and said, in Korean, careful, deliberate, the phrase she'd practiced 100 times, "Thank you. My grandmother taught me that wasting food was a way of forgetting." The silence that followed had a different texture than the silence before it. Taehyun's expression didn't change, but under the table his hand found hers and pressed once, briefly, before releasing. She slept well for the first time in weeks. The mountain air came through the cracked window, and the sound outside was wind and rustling trees and nothing else. No traffic, no sirens, no city. And she lay in the dark and breathed and tried not to think too far ahead. She was here. She was in the house. She had cleared the first gate. Whatever came next, she would handle it. She told herself this the way she'd learned to tell herself things in architecture school when the project felt too large and the deadline too close. You didn't solve a building all at once. You solved the first problem and then the next. You trusted the process because the process was the only thing you had control over. She fell asleep thinking about the courtyard garden, the way the light would move through it in the morning, the arrangement of stones she'd glimpsed through the lacquered doors. She did not dream. Morning. She was up before 7. The household was already moving. She could hear it, quiet and purposeful through the walls. She dressed and found her way to the courtyard through the corridor she'd mapped mentally the night before. The garden was better in morning light than she'd imagined. The stones were not arranged randomly. She saw that immediately. There was a logic to the placement that had a spatial rhythm to it, a pattern that spoke the same language as good architecture, the relationship between mass and void, between presence and absence. Someone had understood proportion deeply. Someone had cared. She was sitting on the covered walkway's edge, sketching in her notebook, when the grandmother appeared. She came slowly, with a cane, and sat on the wooden bench perpendicular to the garden, without acknowledging Zuri directly. Just sat and looked at the stones with the calm of someone who had been looking at them for 60 years. Zuri kept sketching, not performing concentration, actually concentrating. The woman's presence was comfortable in a way that surprised her. There was no obligation in it, no social pressure. They just existed in the same space. After several minutes, the grandmother said something in Korean. Zuri caught fragments. The stones. Something like arrangement. A word she didn't know. She said, carefully, "I'm sorry, I didn't understand all of that." The grandmother looked at her sketchbook. Then she reached over, slowly, and pointed to a section of the drawing, a cluster of 3 stones Zuri had rendered in the sketch, and said something shorter, more direct. Zuri looked at the stones in the garden, then at the drawing, then back. She understood. "The third one is wrong," she said. "In my drawing. It's too close to the second one. They should have more space between them." She didn't know if the grandmother understood her English, but she turned the notebook and she corrected the drawing while the old woman watched. The grandmother made a sound that was not quite a word, something between acknowledgement and approval. They sat together for another 40 minutes without speaking. It was the most comfortable Zuri had felt since landing. The days found a shape. Mornings in the courtyard. Language practice with Su Yan in the afternoons. The teenager had constituted herself as an unofficial tutor with aggressive enthusiasm and a tendency to laugh at Zuri's pronunciation without cruelty. Evenings with the family for dinner, the conversation gradually finding its rhythm. Jisoo asked about Zuri's projects. When Zuri pulled up photographs of the Chicago lakefront proposal on her laptop, Tae-hyun's mother studied them for a long time without speaking, and then she asked a question about the integration of pedestrian flow that was genuinely technical and revealed she understood more about urban design than she'd indicated. Tae-hyun watched this exchange with an expression Zuri had learned to read as satisfaction. Not proud exactly, more like someone watching 2 people recognize each other. She was finding her footing. She knew she was finding it, and she was careful not to become comfortable. Pay attention, she reminded herself, that's all. On the 3rd day, Tae-hyun showed her the estate properly. The outer grounds, the traditional reception rooms that were used only for formal occasions, the smaller rooms that held the actual life of the family. He was a good guide, precise, specific, not performing sentiment, but not hiding it either. The room where his grandfather had received guests before his death. The workshop at the edge of the property where his father had spent every Sunday morning in his youth. The particular window in the east corridor where the afternoon light hit the floor in a way that had been redesigned twice to preserve, because his grandmother had said the original light was the reason she'd married into the family in the first place. "That's a real story?" Zuri said. "She told it at every significant occasion for 30 years, Tae-hyun said. "My father had engineers come in at considerable expense. No one argues with my grandmother." "I've noticed that." They were standing in the east corridor, the late afternoon light doing exactly what it had been expensive engineered to do, pooling gold on the wooden floor between them. "She likes you," Tae-hyun said. "How can you tell? She sat with you in the courtyard for 40 minutes. She's never done that with anyone I've brought here." "You said you've never brought anyone here." "That's why it's significant." She looked at him. The ease of it, the way he looked in this house, in this light. Not more relaxed. Tae-hyun was never relaxed in any conventional sense, but more placed, more fully himself in a way that the international context had slightly diluted. This was the soil he'd come from. She felt something open in her chest. Not just love, though it was that. Something more particular. Something like, yes, this, like a fit. "I want this to work," she said. He said, "It is working." "I know, I just—" She stopped. Let herself be honest. "I want it to work right. Not just for you, for all of them. I don't want to be the woman they accepted because you insisted." Tae-hyun was quiet for a moment. "My mother asked me yesterday if you'd considered working in Seoul. She didn't ask me that. She asked me instead. She was considering the possibility. She doesn't consider the possibility with people she's just accepting to satisfy me." Zuri exhaled. "Pay attention," he said. "That's all." And there was something in his voice when he said it, a warmth that was almost teasing, because she'd said it to him once in Tokyo, sitting in a hotel bar after a conference at 1 in the morning when she'd been trying to explain how she observed buildings. Pay attention. That's all. That's the whole job. She hadn't known then that he'd kept it. On the fourth day, the doors opened. Zuri was in the main reception hall with Su Yan and two household staff, looking at architectural drawings the teenager had found in a storage room, old plans of the original estate construction, ink-faded and magnificent. When she heard the front entrance, she heard voices. She heard the shift in the sound of the house that happened when something changed. Su Yan went still, not startled, the way you went still when something happened that you'd been half expecting and half dreading. The teenager's face closed in a way Zuri had not seen on it before. Su Yan, Zuri said quietly. But the girl was already looking past her, toward the entrance corridor. Footsteps on marble. A measured pace. And then, the woman who entered the reception hall was beautiful in the way that expensive things were beautiful. Considered, precise, arranged without visible effort. She was Korean, mid-20s, dressed with the quiet understatement of old money. She carried herself as though she had entered this house before, many times, and had a right to its rooms. She saw Zuri immediately. Their eyes met across 20 feet of marble floor, and the woman's expression did not change. No surprise, no hostility, just that same measured assessment Zuri had seen in Tae-hyun's mother, but without Jisoo's subsequent softening. Then Zuri's eyes dropped to her hand. The ring was on her left finger, precisely where a ring of that specific significance would be. Diamond, simple setting, exactly the kind of ring that communicated permanence. In the silence that followed, 2 seconds, 3, 4, Zuri's entire understanding of the last 4 days rearranged itself. She heard Su-yeon's breathing beside her. Careful. Controlled. The breathing of someone who was not going to speak. The woman said, in Korean, something that Zuri caught only pieces of. Her own name. She understood that. And then a word she'd studied and knew without wanting to use. Yakhon. Engagement. Betrothed. I'm sorry, the woman said, switching to flawless English, meeting Zuri's eyes directly. I didn't know you would be here. And the thing that undid Zuri, the thing that made the moment worse than simple betrayal, that made it complicated in a way she hadn't prepared for, was that the woman looked genuine when she said it. Not triumphant, not smug, just honest, in the way that people were honest when they were also trapped. Her name, Zuri learned in the next 10 minutes that felt like 10 years, was Choi Nari. And she was wearing the ring that Kang Tae-hyun's family had placed on her finger years before Zuri Bennett had ever walked into a conference room in Boston. Tae-hyun found her in the East Corridor. She was standing at the window, the one with the engineered light, the expensive light, the light someone had paid engineers to preserve because love had once been the reason for it. She had not cried. She was not going to cry. Not here, not in this house where she had spent 4 days learning to prove herself by means other than demonstration. Crying would be a demonstration, and she refused it. He came and stood beside her and did not touch her. Good. Because she wasn't sure what she would do if he touched her. Tell me, she said. She said it quietly. Not cold. She didn't have cold available right now, but stripped down to the basic transaction of it. Tell me the truth. That was all she was asking. Not mercy, not reassurance, just the truth, delivered straight. Tae-hyun said, her name is Choi Na-ri. Her father is Choi Dong-seok. He and my father made an arrangement between their families when Nari and I were still teenagers. It was a political agreement. It was meant to consolidate. He stopped, rephrased. The two families have substantial intersecting interests. The arrangement was meant to formalize that relationship. An arranged marriage. Yes. When were you going to tell me this? Not a question. He heard it as the statement it was. I believed my father had ended it, Tae-hyun said. When I left Korea 5 years ago to expand the international operations, he indicated. He told me the arrangement was suspended. I believed him. You believed him. I was wrong. Zuri said nothing. She looked at the light on the floor. I didn't know Nari would come here, he said. I didn't know she was coming. She wasn't supposed to. This wasn't arranged by my father. I don't believe he knew. Tae-hyun. He stopped. Do you understand, Zuri said, what it felt like to see that ring? A long pause. Yes, he said. Do you understand what it means that I flew to this country? I studied your language. I practiced your customs. I introduced myself to your family. I sat in your grandmother's courtyard. Do you understand all of that? And then do you understand what it is to stand there and watch a woman walk through those doors with your ring on her finger? It's not my ring, he said. Your family's ring, the ring your family put there. She finally looked at him. That's not a small difference, Taehyun. His jaw was tight. She knew that look. The closed silence, not the thinking silence. But she wasn't going to give him the space to manage this at his own pace. Not right now. What is the arrangement, she said, but the real one. Tell me all of it, he told her. It took 20 minutes, standing in that corridor with the engineer's light falling between them on the floor. The Black Phoenix Syndicate. The Crimson Dragon Syndicate. She had known in the abstract way that people knew things they weren't supposed to ask direct questions about, that Kang Global Development had layers she hadn't been shown. She was not naive. She was 24 and she'd grown up in Chicago, and she understood that men like Taehyun did not get to where they were on construction contracts alone. But hearing it explicitly, the names, the structure, the scope of it, was different from the abstract. She listened. She did not interrupt. She asked 2 specific questions, listened to the answers, and then stood in silence for a while. The marriage, she said finally, between you and Nari. It's not just a family promise. No. It's a structural agreement between 2 criminal organizations with financial implications that would collapse if the marriage doesn't happen. Taehyun said, That's an accurate summary, and everyone expects you to honor it. Yes. She looked at him directly. What do you expect? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, I expect I'm going to have the worst conversation of my life with my father tonight, and I expect it will be the first of several. That's not what I asked. Zuri, what do you expect of yourself? The light between them shifted as a cloud passed over the mountain. The corridor dimmed briefly, then brightened. Taehyun said, I am not marrying Nari. He said it the way he said things when they were finished. Not with heat, not like a declaration, just a fact that had already been established in some internal accounting that she wasn't invited into, but whose results she was receiving. Zuri felt something unknot in her chest and immediately retighten, because the unknotting was relief, and the retightening was the recognition that this was not the end of anything. This was the beginning. Your family, she said. Yes. Her family. Yes. What that means for your business. I know. She breathed. One breath, deliberate. The way she breathed before she walked into a presentation she wasn't sure she could carry. I'm not going to fight her, Zuri said. I want you to understand that. I'm not going to compete with her, or undermine her, or perform some kind of... She stopped, found the word. Drama. I'm not that person. I know you're not. And I'm not going to pretend everything is fine and smile my way through this family until someone's ready to deal with it. I'm not that person either. Taehyun looked at her. I'm going to stay, Zuri said, long enough for everyone in this house to know who I actually am. Not who they assumed, not who they feared. Who I am. She paused. And after that, whatever happens is what happens. But I will not disappear, and I will not perform. He said nothing for a moment, then, My grandmother is going to want to see you in the courtyard tomorrow morning. It was such a specific thing to say, such a precise thing. She understood it was his way of saying something he didn't have better words for, that the woman who mattered most to him in this house had already formed a conclusion, and the conclusion was not against her. Zuri nodded. I'll be there, she said. Down the corridor, somewhere in the interior of the house, she could hear the sound of other voices, the particular acoustic of a gathering, of people in proximity who were not at ease, of a situation beginning to assemble itself around her. Nari was still in this house, and somewhere beyond the gates, in Seoul, a man named Choi Dong-seok had a daughter who was wearing a ring that his money and his power and his organization had made into a contractual obligation. And tomorrow, or the day after that, he was going to want an answer. Zuri pressed her hand flat against the cold stone wall beside the window. She had walked into this house with a ring on her own finger and a notebook full of careful practice and a willingness to be seen. She had not walked in prepared for this. But she was here. She was in the house. She was standing. Whatever the next room held, she would walk through it with her spine straight and her eyes open and her hands steady. She had not come 10,000 miles to disappear. Neri was given the West Wing. Zuri learned this from Su Yan, who delivered the information the next morning with the specific flatness of someone reporting a fact they found personally offensive. The teenager appeared at Zuri's door before 7, already dressed, carrying 2 cups of tea she'd made herself in the kitchen because she'd wanted something to do with her hands. "My mother arranged it," Su Yan said. "Last night, after you went to your room, she had the West guest room prepared." Zuri took the tea. "Does that surprise you?" "No." The girl sat on the edge of the low table. "That's what makes it worse." Zuri understood. Jisoo had not done it out of cruelty. She'd done it out of the same iron sense of protocol that governed everything else in this house. Nari was a guest. Nari came from a family with standing, and you housed a guest from a family with standing in a manner that communicated appropriate respect. It was not a statement of preference. It was a statement of obligation, and those were sometimes harder to argue with than preference. "How is she?" Zuri asked. Suyeon looked at her. "You're asking about Nari?" "I'm asking." A pause. Quiet. "She was at dinner after you left. You didn't hear? She sat with my mother, and they talked about something I wasn't included in. She's been here before. She knows where things are. She knows which staff member to ask for what." Suyeon turned her cup in her hands. "She's been coming here since she was 19. That's 6 years. She knows this house better than you do." Zuri said nothing to that. "It's not her fault," Suyeon said, and she said it like it cost her something. "I want it to be. I really want it to be, but she's not. She's never been mean to me. She's never been anything. She's just always been there, like a piece of furniture that everyone arranged their life around because it was easier than moving it. That's not a kind way to describe her." "I know." The teenager looked out the window. "I'm not feeling kind this morning." Neither was Zuri, but she didn't say so. But the courtyard was cold. October in the mountains had a bite to it that Chicago hadn't quite prepared her for. Different quality of cold, something in the altitude and the particular way the stone held the night temperature into the morning hours. Zuri wore a heavier jacket and sat on the walkway edge with her sketchbook and worked on the detail she'd corrected yesterday, the 3 stones and the space between them, the negative space that gave the arrangement its meaning. The grandmother came at the same time as yesterday. Same measured pace, same cane, same wooden bench perpendicular to the garden. They sat in silence for a while. Then the old woman spoke. Longer this time, 4 or 5 sentences, deliberate, as though she'd prepared them. Zuri caught maybe 40% and pieced together the rest from context and instinct. Something about the garden, something about who tends it. A question at the end. "I don't understand all of it," Zuri said in Korean. "I'm sorry." The grandmother made a gesture, not dismissive, more like proceed anyway. Zuri tried, in halting Korean punctuated by English where the words failed her, to say that she thought the garden showed more intelligence than most architecture she'd studied. That whoever had designed it understood that restraint was not the same as poverty, that more space could mean more meaning rather than less. She wasn't sure how much landed, but the grandmother looked at the garden for a long time after she stopped speaking, and then she said something short that Suyeon later translated for her, when Zuri described the exchange over lunch. She said, "A person who understands empty space understands patience." Suyeon repeated it twice, making sure Zuri had it. "It's a compliment, a significant one. She doesn't say that." Zuri wrote it in her notebook. But she came around the corner of the east corridor at 10:30 and nearly walked directly into Nari. They both stopped. The hallway was narrow enough that passing required acknowledgement. You could not pretend not to see someone from 18 inches away. Nari was carrying a book, a slim volume with a Korean title Zuri didn't catch, and she was dressed simply, her hair pulled back, and without the context of the reception hall, she looked younger and less arranged and more human. "Good morning," Nari said, in English immediately, which Zuri noted. "Good morning." A pause that occupied about a year of psychological space. "I wanted to say again," Nari said, "that I didn't know you would be here when I came. That's true." "I believe you," Zuri said. Nari looked at her with something that was not quite surprise, but was adjacent to it, as though she'd prepared for a different response and was recalibrating. "Can I ask you something?" Zuri said. A small nod. Did you come here because you wanted to, or because your father asked you to? The silence that followed was its own answer. Nari's expression didn't collapse. She had too much control for that. But something in it shifted. Something around the eyes that Zuri recognized as the particular strain of someone holding a truth they were not going to say directly. My father, Nari said carefully, has certain expectations regarding this family. That's not what I asked. I know. She looked down at the book in her hands. Her knuckles were not quite white, but they were not relaxed. I came because it was expected. I always do what is expected. I have done what is expected my entire life. She looked up. Is that an answer? It's an honest one, Zuri said. Nari studied her for a moment. You're not what I expected either. What did you expect? Someone easier to dislike. Zuri almost laughed. She didn't, but it was close. I'll try harder. Nari's expression did something complicated. Not quite a smile, but the suppressed beginning of one. And then she moved past Zuri down the corridor with her book held against her chest like a shield. Taehyun found Zuri in the library after lunch. He closed the door, and she knew from the way he closed it, controlled, quiet, the care of someone managing pressure that wanted to express itself differently, that something had happened. My father called this morning, he said. From where? He's in Seoul. He'll be here by Friday. A pause. He knows Nari is here. He knows you're here. He spoke to my mother last night. Zuri set down the book she'd been holding without having read any of it. What did he say to her? He asked her to maintain stability until he arrived. Taehyun's mouth tightened on the word stability. He asked her to ensure Nari was made comfortable. And me? He looked at her directly. He asked her to be polite. There it was. The hierarchy of the instruction, clear in its ordering. Nari made comfortable. Zuri kept polite. The distinction between a person being received and a person being managed. Zuri stood up. How does your mother feel about that? She told him she'd handle it. He moved to the window. Standing the way he stood when he was working something through internally, shoulders set, hands at his sides. My mother is not my father's instrument. She has her own assessments. But she also won't openly contradict him before he arrives. She's waiting to see. Waiting to see what? What he decides, what I decide, what Nari decides. He looked back at her. What you decide. I told you yesterday what I decided. I know. He said it without impatience, just acknowledgement. I need you to understand that Friday will be... My father is not an unreasonable man. He is a man who has kept promises for 30 years and built everything he has on the basis of keeping them. Breaking the arrangement with the Choi family is not, for him, a personal failure. It is a fundamental rupture in how he understands himself. He stopped. I need you to understand that so you understand why the next few days are going to be what they're going to be. I understand it, Zuri said. That doesn't change anything I said yesterday. He looked at her for a long moment. No, he said. I know it doesn't. Dinner that night was the arrangement from a level of difficulty Zuri had not yet encountered. Herself, Taehyun, Jisoo, Soo-yeon, the grandmother, and Nari around the same table, navigating the geography of a situation that everyone present understood and no one was going to name directly. Jisoo managed it with a precision that was almost impressive. Topics moved, silences filled, attention distributed with the equitable detachment of a diplomat who had decided that neutrality was the only viable position. She asked Nari about her work. Nari managed her family's charitable foundation, and asked Zuri about the differences between American and Korean urban planning regulations, and kept both conversations parallel and non-intersecting with the efficiency of someone running two electrical systems in the same building and making absolutely certain the circuits never touched. Soo-yeon contributed almost nothing and focused on her food with the suppressed energy of a person sitting on a secret they were desperately not supposed to tell. The grandmother ate and watched and said nothing. Taehyun sat at the corner of the table between Zuri and the empty chair that was his father's, and he was present without being available, answering when addressed, offering nothing unprompted. Zuri recognized the mode. She'd seen it in meetings when he was in a room where someone else held the authority, and he was waiting with immense patience for the moment to shift. Nari, to her credit, was graceful. She deflected nothing, demanded nothing, occupied her space at the table without pressing its edges. She asked Zuri a question about the Chicago waterfront project. A genuine question, specific, referencing something she couldn't have known about unless she'd actually looked it up at some point. And Zuri answered it directly and without performance. And the exchange lasted 4 minutes and was the most normal 4 minutes of the entire meal. When it was done, Soo-yeon looked between them with the expression of someone recalibrating a situation they'd expected to unfold differently. After dinner, in the corridor outside the dining room, Jisoo stopped beside Zuri. She did not look at her. She straightened an arrangement of dried flowers on the corridor table that did not need straightening. "My husband arrives Friday," she said. "I know. He will want to speak with Tae-hyun." "I understand." Jisoo's hand stilled on the flowers. "You have been respectful in this house. You have been patient. You have not made demands." She paused. "I want you to know that I see that." It was not an endorsement, but it was a registration, an acknowledgement that what Zuri was doing had been observed and catalogued and assigned weight. "Thank you," Zuri said. Jisoo walked away down the corridor without another word, and Zuri stood in the quiet hallway and breathed. Thursday came down on the house like weather. The staff moved differently, faster, tighter, with the specific purposefulness of people preparing for an inspection. Flowers replaced in the formal reception rooms. The dining table reset with the heavier formal service. A vehicle made 2 trips from the city, bringing things Zuri never saw but understood were preparations for a patriarch's return. Soo-yeon disappeared into her room in the morning and did not emerge until afternoon. Nari spent 2 hours in the West Wing and then walked the outer grounds alone in the cold, and Zuri watched her from the East Corridor window with the uncomfortable recognition that the woman walking those paths looked like someone practicing for something she was dreading. Tae-hyun called his father. Zuri didn't hear the call, but she heard the door of his office close at 9 in the morning and didn't open again until after 11. When he came out, the set of his face told her enough. Not broken. Tae-hyun didn't break in ways that were visible, but carved down to something harder and more essential. The conversation had been what it had been, man. He passed her in the corridor and said quietly without stopping, "I told him." And? He said we would discuss it when he arrived. A beat. He didn't argue. He didn't negotiate. He just said we would discuss it. He glanced at her. With my father, that is not a reassuring response. She wanted to ask more, but he was already moving, already somewhere internal where she couldn't follow, and she let him go. That evening, Soo-yeon appeared in Zuri's room again, but this time she didn't have tea and she didn't sit on the table. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and her face carrying something Zuri hadn't seen on it yet. "Can I ask you something real?" the teenager said. "Yes?" "Do you know what my brother actually does? Like, do you actually know?" Zuri held her gaze. "Yes," Soo-yeon exhaled. "Okay." She leaned against the doorframe. "Because I've been watching you since you got here, and I've been trying to figure out if you know and you're okay with it, or if you know and you're not, or if you don't know and you're just—" She stopped. "Because if you don't know, then everything that's about to happen this weekend is going to hit you in a completely different way than if you do." "I know," Zuri said. "All of it. And you're still here." "I'm still here." Soo-yeon looked at her for a long, assessing moment. The same assessment she'd done at the car on the first day, but deeper now, with more information behind it. "Nari knows too," the girl said quietly. "She's always known. She grew up in it. She never had the option of not knowing." She paused. "I think that's why she's always seemed so, I don't know, tired. Like someone who's been carrying a bag that was packed for them before they were old enough to choose what goes in it." Zuri said nothing. "I'm not trying to make you feel sorry for her," Soo-yeon said quickly. "I know you're not. I just—" The girl pushed off the doorframe. "I want tomorrow to go okay. I want my father to come home and I want it to go okay, and I know it's not going to, but I want it to." She looked young suddenly, genuinely 17. "Does that make sense?" "It makes perfect sense," Zuri said. After Soo-yeon left, Zuri sat on the edge of her bed in the quiet of the East Wing and looked at the ring on her finger. Simple. Exactly right. The ring Tae-hyun had put there on a kitchen floor in Chicago at midnight when neither of them had wanted to stop talking long enough to sit at the table like normal people. She thought about the woman in the West Wing, carrying 6 years of expectation in a ring she hadn't chosen. She thought about Su Yan's face saying tired. She thought about a man driving toward this house from Seoul right now, in the dark, carrying 30 years of kept promises and the certainty that the world operated on obligation. She thought about Taehyun's voice in the corridor. I am not marrying Nari. The flatness of it, the finality, the way it had not sounded like a declaration, but like a door that had already been closed. None of this was going to be solved by her patience or her correct bowing depth or her notebook full of practiced phrases. What was coming through those gates tomorrow was something else entirely, and the only question that remained, the one she hadn't let herself ask directly yet, because asking it directly made it real, was whether the man who loved her was willing to burn down 30 years of his father's world to keep that door closed, and whether she could live with herself if he did. The gate cameras would catch Kang Tae-jun's vehicle in the morning. The guards would step aside, the doors would open. And whatever this house had been for the last 4 days, the courtyard mornings, the engineered light, the careful meals, the small earned moments of recognition, it was about to become something different, something none of them could walk back from. Kang Tae-jun arrived at 11:17 on Friday morning. Zuri knew the exact time because she was in the courtyard when she heard the gates, and she looked at her watch with the automatic precision of someone who had learned that knowing the time was a way of anchoring yourself when everything else was moving. The sound of the vehicle on the private road, then the particular silence that preceded the main door's opening, the household holding its breath. She stayed in the courtyard. She was not going to position herself in the entrance hall like someone auditioning. She was not going to absent herself to her room like someone hiding. The courtyard was where she had been every morning since she arrived, and she would be there now, and if that communicated anything to anyone, it communicated exactly what she intended. She was a person who occupied space consistently. The grandmother was already on her bench. The old woman looked at Zuri when the gate sounds came and said something brief, a single sentence, and Zuri caught the word for storm, and the word that meant something like already here. Yes, Zuri said. I know. She didn't meet Tae-jun until lunch. The morning belonged to the family. She understood that without being told, it was in the acoustic of the house, the closed doors, the staff moving with their eyes down. Taehyun spent 90 minutes with his father in the formal study. She heard nothing of it. When he came out and passed her in the corridor on the way to find his sister, his face had the carved-down qualities she'd seen the day before, but worse now, stripped to something that was almost expressionless in the way that things were expressionless when the expression had been deliberately removed. He stopped. Lunch. 1 o'clock. My father wants everyone present. Okay. He looked at her. He's not what you're expecting. I don't have expectations. Everyone has expectations of my father. He said it without bitterness, just as fact. Whatever yours are, set them aside. He is going to be, he found the word, courteous. He is going to be entirely courteous, and you need to understand that as the thing it actually is, rather than the thing it appears to be. She understood. Courtesy is control. Courtesy is the method by which a man who had built an empire communicated that he was the one determining the temperature of every room he entered. I'll be there, she said. Kang Tae-jun was 61 years old and looked 55. Not in the maintained, effortful way of men who fought age. In the way of men whose discipline had simply never permitted it purchase. He was not tall. He was compact, controlled, with Taehyun's same quality of complete stillness and his mother's precise posture. And when he looked at Zuri across the lunch table for the first time, she felt the full weight of an intelligence that had been assessing people for decades and had developed very little patience for what it found. He said, in English that was careful and exact, Miss Bennett, I have heard a great deal about your work. Thank you for receiving me in your home, Zuri said. He inclined his head, a measured degree of acknowledgement, nothing more. The lunch proceeded with the same surface discipline as the dinners before it, but the atmosphere had changed entirely. Jisoo was quieter. Soo-yeon barely spoke. Nari sat with the stillness of someone who had been in this specific dynamic before and knew its rules precisely. Taehyun ate without looking at his father directly, which Zuri noticed because it was the first time she'd seen him avoid anyone's eyes at a table. Tae-jun asked Zuri questions about Chicago, about her firm, about the specific technical challenges of waterfront infrastructure in freshwater versus tidal environments. The questions were genuine. He'd done research, she could tell from their specificity. He'd looked her up. And she answered them genuinely. And for 20 minutes, it was almost a normal conversation about urban development between two people who understood the subject. Then he said, "My son tells me you have been here 5 days." "Yes. And in that time, you have made a considerable impression on my family." She said nothing. It wasn't a question. "My wife tells me you speak Korean. I'm learning. My mother sat with you in the courtyard. She's been generous with her time." Taejun looked at her with the specific attention of someone who had listened to the answers and found them technically correct and entirely insufficient. "Miss Bennett," he said, "you are an intelligent woman. I believe you understand the situation in this house completely." "I believe I do." "Then you understand that my son's happiness, however much I value it, is not the only consideration here." The table had gone very quiet. Even the staff near the sideboard had found reasons to be motionless. "I understand that," Zuri said. "I also understand that a man who built what you've built over 30 years didn't do it by solving every problem the same way it had always been solved." Taejun looked at her. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Then he picked up his cup and drank, and the temperature in the room recalibrated by a fraction of a degree, and lunch continued. But when she looked at Nari across the table, the other woman's eyes were already on her, and in them was something Zuri couldn't categorize. Not hostility, not sympathy exactly. Something more like recognition. The look of one person watching another step onto a surface they know is thinner than it appears. The meeting happened at 3 o'clock. Not a family meeting. A meeting between Tae-jun and Tae-hyun in the formal study, doors closed, with Choi Dong-seok joining by secure video call. Zuri knew about it because Soo-yeon told her, pale-faced, 30 minutes beforehand. "Nari's father," the girl said. "He's calling in. My father arranged it this morning." She was gripping the sleeve of her own sweater. "They're going to resolve it. That's what my father said. They are going to resolve it." "Where's Nari?" "West Wing. She knows." Zuri sat with that information for a moment. "Okay." "Okay." Soo-yeon's voice cracked at the edge. "Zuri." "I can't be in that room," Zuri said quietly. "Neither can you. Whatever happens in that room is between them. All we can do is be what we've been being. What if it doesn't matter? What if being what we've been being doesn't—" The girl stopped. Her eyes were bright, and she was furious about it, 17 and trying not to cry in a way that looked exactly like fighting. "What if my father just decides and Taehyun just— what if he doesn't fight?" "He'll fight," Zuri said. "You don't know that." "Yes, I do." Soo-yeon looked at her. "How?" "Because I know how he sets things down when they're finished," Zuri thought. "Because I know the difference between his closed silence and his thinking silence, and neither of them looked like surrender." "Trust me," she said instead. It wasn't enough, and they both knew it, but Soo-yeon sat down beside her on the bench in the east corridor and they waited together, which was the only thing available. The study doors opened at 5:12. Taehyun came out first. He walked past the corridor entrance without looking in their direction, moving toward the east stairs with a directness that meant he needed to not be where he was. Zuri caught one look at his face and felt something cold move through her chest. Not broken, not defeated. Worse than that, the face of someone who had just been shown the exact dimensions of the cage around them. She found him in the room at the top of the east stairs, a sitting room the family didn't use much, furniture arranged around a cold fireplace, the kind of room that accumulated the things a household had no immediate use for but wasn't ready to discard. He was standing at the window with his back to her. "Tell me," she said. He turned. "Choi Dong-seok is coming here." She went still, in person, tomorrow morning. He said it with the flat delivery of someone reporting structural damage. No emotion, because the emotion was too large for the words currently available. The call was not a negotiation. My father presented my position, and Dong-seok's response was to say that this conversation required his physical presence. He looked at her. When a man like Choi Dong-seok decides a situation requires his physical presence, it means the situation has moved past the level where agreements can settle it. What does that mean specifically? It means he's coming to make a statement, not to negotiate, to demonstrate that the arrangement stands and that any deviation from it has consequences he is willing to enforce in person. The word enforce sat between them with its full weight. Consequences for who? Zuri said. For my father's organization, for the shipping contracts, for the port agreements. He paused. For me. She looked at him directly. For you physically, possibly. He said it without flinching. Dong-seok does not threaten, he arrives. The threat is in the arriving. Zuri stood very still. Her hands were at her sides and she was aware of them the way you became aware of your own body when the ground shifted. The specific weight of existing in it, the breath moving through it. Your father, she said. What does he want? Taehyun's jaw tightened. He wants me to understand what I'm asking him to sacrifice. And what did you say? I said I understood it completely. He looked away from her, back toward the window. He said understanding it and accepting it were different things. He said he had never in 30 years broken his word to another family, and that if I forced him to do so, now he would... A pause. Something moved across his face that she had not seen there before. Something that looked like grief. He said he would support my decision, but he said it the way men say things when they're telling you they will comply and they will never forgive you for making them. The room was cold, the fireplace empty, the late afternoon light coming gray through the window. Zuri said, He's not the one who made the decision. He arranged my life before I was old enough to... Taehyun. Her voice was quiet, but it stopped him. Your father arranged an agreement when you were a teenager. You spent 5 years abroad believing it was canceled. You built a life on that belief. You proposed to me on that belief. She kept her eyes on him. The person who has to reckon with the original error is him, not you. You are not responsible for keeping a promise made for you before you could consent to it. He looked at her. That is not how my father understands obligation. I know it's not, but it's how I understand it. He was quiet for a long moment. Dong-seok will be here at 10, he said finally. My father has asked for a formal dinner tomorrow evening. Everyone present. The word everyone was carrying more weight than it could comfortably hold. He believes that if Dong-seok meets you, if he sees the situation directly, that perhaps he thinks Dong-seok seeing me might change something. He hopes it. Zuri almost said that's not how men like Dong-seok work. She almost said a man who announces his arrival as a power demonstration doesn't come to be persuaded. She stopped herself because Taehyun already knew all of this, and saying it would only be cruelty dressed as honesty. I'll be there, she said. He crossed the room. He put both hands on her face and she let him, and they stood like that in the cold sitting room with the gray light coming through the window and the weight of what was coming pressing down on both of them. I need you to know something, he said. Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever my father says, whatever Dong-seok says. I know, she said. Let me say it. She waited. I chose you, he said, not because you were available or convenient or because you arrived at the right moment. I chose you because you are the only person I have ever met who makes me want to build things instead of control them. He looked at her. That doesn't change. None of what's coming changes that. She believed him. That was the hardest part. She believed him completely, and the belief sat in her chest alongside the cold knowledge that what a person chose and what a person could keep were not always the same thing. Choi Dong-seok arrived at 10:15 the next morning. 2 vehicles. 4 men she didn't recognize who deployed from the second car with the practiced efficiency of people who were paid to be in front of trouble. Dong-seok himself emerged from the first vehicle and stood for a moment in the drive, looking at the estate with the expression of someone surveying property. Not his property, but property he was deciding about. He was in his late 50s, heavy set in a way that communicated density rather than excess, with a face that had very little to read on it. He wore a dark suit and no tie, and he moved toward the entrance with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never in his adult life walked into a room uncertain of his position in it. Zuri watched him from the East Corridor window. She had seen powerful men before. She'd presented to them, worked alongside them, navigated rooms built by and for them. She knew the architecture of that kind of authority, how it organized space around itself, how other people unconsciously reoriented when it moved. But there was a specific quality to Dong-seok that was different. It was in the way his men moved around him. Not protective exactly, more like orbiting, the way objects moved around mass. She stepped back from the window before he looked up. The formal meeting was in the main reception room, the one the family used only for significant occasions. Taehyun and his father were already inside when Dong-suk entered, and Zuri knew this from the sounds of the house, the closing of the large wooden doors, the subsequent and very deliberate quiet. Neri was in the east sitting room. Zuri found her there not by plan, but because she was trying to find a place to be that didn't feel like either waiting or running, and the east sitting room was where she ended up, and Nari was already there. They looked at each other. "Your father's in with them," Zuri said. "I know. Are you all right?" Neri looked at the question like it was a kind of food she hadn't tasted in a long time and wasn't sure she remembered how to eat. "He called me last night," she said, "before he drove up." She was sitting with her hands folded in her lap with a stillness that looked practiced rather than natural. "He told me to remember what this family means for ours. He said—" She stopped, started again more carefully. "He said that some things were larger than individual preference." "And you said?" "I said yes." Her voice was even, completely, terrifyingly even. "I always say yes. I have been saying yes my entire life, and I'm very good at it, and it costs me—" She stopped again. The sentence stayed unfinished in the room. Zuri sat down across from her. Not to comfort, she wasn't sure comfort was what Nari needed or wanted, but because standing felt like a position of advantage. And this wasn't that moment. "What does it cost you?" she said. Nari looked at her hands. The ring caught the light from the window. "Everything," she said, quietly. "A very small amount at a time, so no single removal is enough to notice. Until you add it up." Zuri said nothing. "I don't want this," Nari said, very quietly, without looking up. "I want you to know that. Not because it changes anything, just because it is the true thing, and I am so tired of saying the untrue things." She finally looked up. "I have never wanted to marry Tae-hyun. I don't love him. I have never loved him. He has never loved me. We have been politely pretending for 6 years for the benefit of two families who would not survive the honesty." The words landed in the room with the particular weight of things that had been held in too long. "Then why—" Zuri started. "Because my father built his empire on that alliance." Nari's voice was still even, but something in it had gone fragile at the edges. "Because without the Kang family's infrastructure, half of my father's legitimate operations collapse. Because I was raised to understand that my purpose was the preservation of what my family built. And I have not yet found a way to want something different badly enough to pay what wanting it differently would cost." She said it like a confession, like something she'd said in her own head 1,000 times but never out loud. Zuri looked at her for a long moment. "What would you want," she said, "if the cost were removed?" Nari looked back at her with eyes that were entirely dry and entirely devastated. "Someone who chose me," she said. "Just that. Someone who actually chose me." The reception room doors opened. The sound of it moved through the house like a pressure change. Both women went still. Footsteps in the formal corridor. Multiple sets. The heavier tread of men who had been sitting with significant things for 2 hours and were now moving with the direction of concluded decision. Tae-hyun appeared in the doorway of the east sitting room. His face told Zuri everything before he spoke. Not the carved-down quality of managed pressure. Something else. Something she had not seen on him before. A specific, contained devastation that a person wore when the worst outcome had not merely been threatened, but formally arranged. "Zuri," he said. She stood up. "My father has agreed to Dong-suk's terms," he said. His voice was level, completely, deliberately level. "The wedding date has been set." The room didn't move. The light didn't change. Everything in it continued exactly as it had been a second before. "He agreed," Zuri said, "without consulting me. As the head of this family, he accepted the terms." Something moved behind Tae-hyun's eyes. Not anger, not yet. Something hotter and harder than anger. The particular fire of a person discovering that the ground they trusted had never been solid. "The date is in 6 weeks. Dong-suk made it a condition of preserving the alliance. My father said yes." Nari made a sound, very small, like a word that had been stopped before it could become itself. Zuri stood in the east sitting room with the afternoon light coming through the window and the ring on her finger and 10,000 miles of distance between her and every familiar thing she'd ever known. And she looked at the man she loved carrying the specific wreckage of a decision his father had just made for him. and she understood with a clarity that was almost physical that she had reached the exact edge of everything patience and dignity and careful preparation could carry her. Whatever came next could not be navigated with a notebook full of practiced phrases. Whatever came next required something she hadn't fully located in herself yet, something harder and more dangerous than respect. She looked at Tae-hyun and said very quietly, "Take me to your father." Tae-hyun didn't move immediately. He stood in the doorway of the east sitting room and looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not reluctance, something more complicated than that. The particular look of a man who understood what she was asking and was calculating in the space of 3 seconds, whether the consequences of honoring it were ones he could contain. "Zuri, take me to your father," she said again. He held her gaze for one more second, then he stepped back from the doorway. She followed him into the corridor. Behind her, she heard Nari exhale. A single breath, controlled, the sound of someone watching something they had not expected and did not yet know how to categorize. The formal study was at the end of the main corridor past the reception rooms, behind a set of doors that were heavier than they needed to be for any purely practical reason. Tae-hyun stopped outside them. He put his hand on the door and turned to look at her one more time. "He won't be alone," he said quietly. "Dong-seok is still inside." "I know." "This is not the way these conversations—" "I know it's not." She kept her voice even. "Open the door." He opened it. The study was large, formal, organized with the deliberate precision of a room that communicated authority before a word was spoken. Bookshelves, floor to ceiling on the north wall. A desk positioned to make whoever sat behind it the clear axis of the room. 2 sets of chairs arranged in a configuration that was not quite facing each other and not quite parallel. The geometry of a conversation that was not between equals. Taejun was standing near the window. Dong-seok sat in one of the chairs with his jacket still buttoned and his hands resting on his knees, and when the door opened his eyes moved to Zuri with the flat attention of a man who had been informed of her existence and had already filed her in a category. One of Dong-seok's men was near the door. He shifted when she entered, not aggressively, just the automatic repositioning of a person whose job was proximity to his employer. Taejun looked at his son, then at Zuri. "Miss Bennett," he said. His voice was controlled. The courtesy was still there, the precise English, but it had compressed into something thinner and cooler. "I need a few minutes," she said. "With you. Not with everyone. With you." Taejun glanced at Dong-seok. Dong-seok said nothing. He was watching Zuri with the same flat attention, unreadable, the face of someone who had decided that what was happening in front of him was a minor variable he had already accounted for. "This is not a suitable—" Taejun began. "I know it's not suitable," Zuri said. "I know exactly how unsuitable this is. I know I am standing in a room where I have no formal standing, in a conversation I was not invited into, asking for time that protocol says I haven't earned." She kept her eyes on Taejun. "I'm asking anyway." The room was entirely still. Taejun looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something in Korean to Dong-seok, short and direct. Dong-seok stood, straightened his jacket, and moved toward the door without expression. His man followed. Tae-hyun met his father's eyes, and Taejun shook his head slightly, a single, minimal motion. And Tae-hyun stopped, then stepped back into the corridor and pulled the door closed behind him. The study was quiet. Just the two of them. Taejun moved to the desk and stood behind it, not sitting, standing, which preserved the architecture of the room's authority, and looked at her with the face of a man who was waiting to see what the next 30 seconds would cost him. "You have your minutes," he said. Zuri's heart was hitting the inside of her chest so hard she could feel it in her throat. She breathed through it. One breath, calibrated. The same breath she used before a presentation, before a difficult client, before any room she'd had to walk into and hold on her own. "I want to talk about the waterfront development project in Incheon," she said. Taejun blinked. It was the smallest possible blink, a fraction of a second, but it was the first uncontrolled response she had seen from him, and she registered it precisely. "The Incheon Harbor redevelopment," she continued, "the Phase 2 expansion, the shipping terminal integration on the northern basin." She moved to the chair across the desk and sat down without being invited. "I looked at the public filings before I came to Korea. I look at all the public filings associated with any project Tae-hyun's company has involvement in. It's how I work. She met his eyes directly. The Northern Basin integration has a sediment variability problem that the current engineering plans don't account for. The same problem the Chicago lakefront proposal had when I first saw it, before I rebuilt the approach. If it's not corrected before Phase 2 construction begins, you're looking at foundation instability in the second and third berths within 8 to 12 years. Taejun said nothing. I also looked at the port agreements your organization holds in partnership with the Choi family's logistics operations, she said. The Busan Secondary Container Facility, the Jeju Transit Arrangement, the shipping corridor along the western coast. She paused. Those agreements give the Choi family infrastructure leverage that your organization doesn't need to maintain through a marriage contract. There are American development investment groups. I've worked with 2 of them directly on the Chicago project, who are currently looking for exactly the kind of legitimate Asian infrastructure partnership those facilities represent, without the political complications of a family alliance. Taejun's hands, flat on the desk, did not move. I'm not telling you I can deliver those partnerships, Zuri said. I'm telling you I can make the introduction. I'm telling you the financial logic of the Choi alliance was sound when it was made, and I'm telling you it is no longer the only way to secure that logic. She kept her voice steady. And I'm telling you that the man you raised, the man who saw something in a Chicago lakefront proposal that everyone else in that room missed, that man does not deserve to have his life arranged for him at 61 years old by a decision you made for him when he was 15. The silence went on long enough that she heard her own pulse. Taejun moved. He came around the desk slowly, the way he did everything, deliberate, without waste, and stopped in front of the chair beside hers. He looked at her from that distance, close enough that she could see the particular quality of his focus, the thing his son had inherited that was not coldness, but its opposite, a concentration so complete it could be mistaken for coldness from the outside. He sat down, not behind the desk, beside her. The sediment variability issue in the Northern Basin, he said, and his voice had changed. Not warmer, but different, the shift of a man who had stopped performing a role and started thinking. The engineering team presented their assessment 6 months ago. Their assessment was based on the 2019 survey data. The 2023 survey data shows a 14% shift in the primary deposition layer. I found it in the Incheon Port Authority public records. She pulled out her phone. She had loaded the documents 3 nights ago, alone in the East Wing, because she had known she would need them even if she hadn't known exactly how, and pulled up the survey comparison. She placed the phone on the desk between them. Taejun looked at it. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "Show me." They talked for 47 minutes, not about the marriage, not about Dong-seok, not about the alliance or the obligation or the 30 years of his word. They talked about infrastructure, about sediment patterns, about the specific mathematics of tidal birth stability, about the 2 American investment groups. She named them. She gave him the names of her contacts. She described the scale of capital they were currently deploying and the specific gaps in their Asian infrastructure portfolio that the Kang-associated port facilities could fill. She talked about it the way she talked about buildings, without sentiment, without decoration, with the precise respect for physical reality that the subject demanded. She showed him drawings she'd made in her notebook at 2 in the morning, rough but structurally coherent, the modified approach to the Northern Basin berths that address the sediment problem. She described the Chicago project outcome in numbers. She described the methodology. She did not oversell. She did not promise what she couldn't deliver. She treated him like a partner, not a future father-in-law, not an adversary, a partner in a technical problem with significant financial stakes. And somewhere around the 30-minute mark, Kang Tae-jun began asking questions that were not rhetorical. What? When the door opened, it had been almost an hour. Tae-hyun was in the corridor. He looked at his father, then at Zuri, and the question on his face was so raw and so unguarded that it was almost painful to look at. A man stripped of his management, waiting for a verdict on the rest of his life. Tae-jun looked at his son. Something passed between them. Not a resolution. It was not that clean and not that fast, but a shift. The particular shift in the space between 2 people when one of them has revised a position they hadn't intended to revise. Tae-jun said, in Korean, something short. Tae-hyun's expression changed. Not relief, too complex for relief, but the easing of one specific layer of pressure. He says we'll speak after dinner, Tae-hyun told her quietly in English. He says he has more questions about the Northern Basin survey. She nodded. He looked at her with an expression she didn't have a name for, like he was seeing her from a new angle, like the angle itself was something he needed a moment to absorb. "Did you just—" he started. "I'll tell you later," she said. What she hadn't calculated was Dong-seok. She should have calculated Dong-seok. She knew this the moment she saw him standing in the main corridor outside the formal dining room that evening, 2 hours before dinner, with his jacket still buttoned and his face carrying the information that he had spent the last hour becoming aware that the conversation in the study had not gone the way he'd expected. He looked at her with the flat attention that she now understood was not neutrality, but the specific expression of a man who had assessed a situation and found an element he needed to remove. "Miss Bennett," he said, in English. Careful English. She stopped. She was alone in the corridor. Tae-hyun was upstairs. The household was in dinner preparation. The corridor was quiet in a way she suddenly felt as a specific quality of vulnerability. "Mr. Choi," she said. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. The man by the dining room door, his man, always his man, was 10 feet away and not looking at them. Not looking. "I want you to understand something," Dong-seok said. His English was more deliberate than Tae-jun's, selected with care, each word placed like a tile. "The arrangement between our families is not a business contract. It is not a financial instrument. It is not a thing that can be replaced with alternative investment structures." His eyes didn't move from hers. "It is a matter of word, of standing, of what it means to be a man who has given his word in the presence of other men who gave theirs." She held his gaze. Her pulse was elevated, but her hands were steady. "I understand that," she said. "You do not understand it," he said. Flat, not cruel, simply correcting an inaccuracy. "You understand its surface. You are an intelligent woman, and you have found a way to speak to Tae-jun about things he values. I recognize what you did. It was effective." He paused on the word in a way that made it something other than a compliment. But effectiveness does not change the nature of what was agreed. And a person who enters a room and rearranges the furniture does not own the house. "No," Zuri said. "She doesn't." He waited. "But she knows which walls are load-bearing," she said, "and which ones someone built too fast, out of materials that were convenient rather than sound." The silence in the corridor had a texture to it. Dong-seok looked at her with something that moved behind his eyes, the first thing she had seen move there, and she could not tell if it was anger or something that was adjacent to respect in the way that certain things were adjacent to their opposites. "You are not afraid of me," he said. "I'm afraid," she said. "I'm just not going to let it make my decisions." He looked at her for another 3 seconds. Then he moved past her down the corridor without another word, and she stood very still until his footsteps faded and her heart rate began to come down from where it had gone. Her hands were not entirely steady when she pressed them against the wall, but they were close. Sakye. Dinner, the formal table, the full household, Tae-jun at the head, Ji-soo to his right, the grandmother in her position, Soo-yeon quiet and watchful, Tae-hyun beside Zuri, Nari across the table, her face composed in a way that Zuri now recognized as the specific composure of a person whose composure had been their only available resource for years. Dong-seok to Tae-jun's left, his position at the table communicating that this was still his negotiation, still his room, regardless of what had happened in the study. The meal proceeded. No one named what was happening. The food was extraordinary and no one tasted it. The conversation managed by Ji-soo with her diplomat's precision, moving topics with the skill of a woman who had spent decades maintaining surface stability over whatever was happening beneath it. Then the grandmother spoke. She spoke at length, longer than Zuri had ever heard her speak at the dinner table. Her voice was quiet, but it carried, and the room reconfigured around it the way rooms reconfigured around things with genuine authority, not performed authority, not bought authority, just the thing itself. Everyone at the table went still. Tae-hyun translated for her quietly, his voice low near her ear. "She's talking about when she came to this family," he said. "She was 19. She came from a family with less standing than this one. There were people who said her presence here was unsuitable, that she didn't understand the weight of what she was entering." A pause as the old woman continued. "She says she understood it better than people thought. She says she understood it because she came without pretense. She came willing to be seen as she actually was, without the protection of position or arrangement. He paused. She says she has watched a person do the same thing this week. She says that kind of courage doesn't announce itself. It's recognizable only to people who have had to exercise it themselves. Zuri's throat closed briefly. She swallowed through it. The grandmother looked directly at Dong-seok when she finished speaking. She said something else. Short. Direct. Taehyun was quiet for a moment. She says, he said carefully, that a house built on obligation produces children who spend their lives trying to escape it. She says she has watched that happen. She will not watch it again. Dong-seok's face did not change, but his hands, on the table, pressed flat for a moment in a way that was not relaxed. Taejun looked at his mother. Something moved across his face that was too old and too private to interpret. Decades of a specific relationship compressed into a single expression. He looked then at Dong-seok. "We should speak privately after dinner," Taejun said. In Korean, and Zuri didn't need it translated. Dong-seok looked at him. The flat attention, the assessment, then, yes. The word carried everything it needed to. After dinner in the corridor, Taehyun caught Zuri's arm. "He's going to push back hard," he said. His voice was low, taut. "Whatever my father is considering. Dong-seok came here to close this. He doesn't leave situations open. He'll apply every form of pressure he has before he walks out of that room." "I know. Zuri." He gripped her arm. Not hard, but present. "If this goes wrong, if Dong-seok decides that losing the alliance isn't the worst outcome available to him, what's the worst outcome available to him?" Taehyun looked at her. "Making an example," he said. The words sat between them in the corridor with their full, undecorated meaning. Zuri looked at him. "Then make sure it doesn't go wrong." "I'm not in that room." "I know." She put her hand over his on her arm. "But your father is, and your grandmother just said the only true thing that's been said in this house since you opened those doors." She held his eyes. "Trust her. Trust him. Trust what you've built." He looked at her for a long moment. Then the study door at the end of the corridor opened, and Tae-jun stood in the frame, and he looked at his son with an expression that was asking for something, asking without asking, the way fathers sometimes did when the words for the thing they needed weren't available to them. Taehyun held Zuri's gaze for one more second. Then he walked toward his father. The door closed. And in the west wing of the house, in a room 20 meters away, a woman named Choi Nari sat alone with a ring on her finger and a choice forming in her chest that no one had asked her to make, and that no arrangement, no alliance, no 30 years of obligation had ever accounted for. Because no one had ever bothered to ask her what she wanted, and she was finally, after 26 years of silence, tired enough to answer. The study door stayed closed for 2 hours and 11 minutes. Zuri knew because she counted again. Not obsessively, not the frantic counting of someone with nothing to do, but the deliberate counting of someone who needed a number to hold on to while everything else was out of her hands. She sat in the east corridor on the low wooden bench near the window where the engineered light fell, and she counted the minutes, and she breathed, and she did not go to her room because going to her room would have been a retreat, and she was done retreating. Suyeon found her at the 40-minute mark and sat beside her without speaking. The teenager's shoulder pressed against hers, not leaning, just present, just the physical fact of another person choosing proximity. And they sat together in the quiet corridor while the house made its nighttime sounds around them. At the 90-minute mark, Jisoo appeared at the far end of the corridor. She walked toward them slowly. She was still dressed from dinner, her posture unchanged, the surface of her as composed as it had been at the table. But her hands, Zuri watched her hands, were not moving with their usual deliberate economy. One of them was pressed against her own side lightly, as though steadying something. She stopped in front of the bench. She looked at Zuri for a long moment. Then she sat down on Zuri's other side. 3 women on a bench in a corridor, not speaking. The grandmother's words from dinner still in the air somewhere, not dissipated, the way significant things didn't dissipate immediately. A house built on obligation produces children who spend their lives trying to escape it. Jisoo said, quietly, in Korean, something Zuri mostly caught. Something about the courtyard. About the morning Zuri had corrected her own drawing while the grandmother watched. She switched to English without announcement, as though the language were simply a different room in the same conversation. "She told me that evening. She called me to her room and she told me what you did. A pause. My mother-in-law has lived in this house for 53 years. She does not volunteer observations about guests. Zuri said nothing. I want you to know, Jisoo said, that I was not always neutral in this situation. I made assumptions before you arrived. I had arrangements in my mind, a way I believed this would proceed. Her hand settled in her lap, deliberate now, the control returning. I want you to know that I was wrong to have those arrangements. It was not an apology. Jisoo was not a woman whose vocabulary included apology in the conventional sense, but it was the thing it was, which was more honest than an apology, and Zuri received it as such. I know it wasn't personal, Zuri said. No. Jisoo looked at the window, the dark glass, the mountain beyond it invisible now. It was structural, which is sometimes worse because structural things don't require a person to make a bad choice. They simply inherit a design someone else drew. The corridor was quiet for a while. Then the study door opened. Taehyun came out first, and his face told her that whatever had happened in that room had cost him. Not defeated, the opposite of defeated, if anything, but scraped down to something essential, something that had been through enough pressure to become a different, harder thing. He looked like himself, but more so. Like a version of himself that had been forced to exist without the protection of management or control. His father came out behind him. Taejun's face was the one she couldn't immediately read. He looked older than he had at dinner, not physically, but in some way that the hour had added to him, some weight that hadn't been visible before and was now simply present and undeniable. He looked like a man who had paid something. Dong-seok was not with them. Zuri looked at the empty doorway. He's still inside, Taehyun said quietly. He needed a few minutes. She understood what that meant. It meant the room had not gone Dong-seok's way, and a man like Dong-seok needed private space to absorb a loss before he was willing to present himself again in company. Taejun looked at Zuri. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression that she would spend a long time afterward trying to find exact words for. There was something in it that was recognition, the specific recognition of someone seeing a thing they had assessed incorrectly and correcting the assessment without drama. There was something in it that was grief, old and pre-existing, nothing to do with her. There was something in it that was very carefully at the far edge of its range, not warmth, not yet, but the first degree of temperature above the absence of it. He said, in English, "The Northern Basin survey data you showed me. I would like you to send it formally to my engineering team." She said, "I will." He nodded once. Then he looked at his son. Another look. This one entirely in Korean, nothing Zuri could read, nothing that was for her. A look that passed between a father and a son who had just broken something between them and were both, in this moment, beginning to understand what it would take to rebuild it. Taehyun received the look, and something in his chest moved. She could see it from here, the rise and settle of a breath taken and released. And he nodded. Taejun walked past them all down the corridor toward the family quarters, and his footsteps were heavier than they'd been before dinner. Dong-seok came out of the study 12 minutes later. He was still immaculate, still buttoned. Whatever the hour had cost him was internal and would stay there, and Zuri respected that even now. The man's discipline was genuine, not performance, and she could see the real thing even in an adversary. He stopped in the corridor. He looked at Taehyun first. A look that lasted 3 seconds and communicated the exact status of what stood between them. Not animosity, not alliance, but the specific recalibration of two organizations that had been aligned and were now something else, and would need time to determine what that something else was. A truce with no clean edges. Then he looked at Zuri. She met his eyes. He said, "You have courage and intelligence and very poor timing, Miss Bennett." She said, "The timing wasn't my choice." "No." He considered that. "No, I suppose it wasn't." He looked at her for one more second. "My daughter." He stopped. Restarted, which was the first time she had seen him restart a sentence. "I want my daughter to be—" The word he was looking for resisted him. She watched him search for it with the particular effort of a man for whom the vocabulary of his child's interior life was a foreign language he had never properly studied. "I want her to be well." It was inadequate, and it was true, and they both knew both things simultaneously. "I know you do," Zuri said. He looked at her a moment longer. Then he moved down the corridor with his man behind him, and Zuri heard the front door, the footsteps on the drive, the vehicles starting, and then the sound of the gate, and then silence. Nari was in the west wing. Zuri knocked. The door opened after a long pause. Nari in the same clothes from dinner, her hair loosened now, her face with the particular rawness of someone who had been holding composure for hours and had finally, in private, allowed something to slip. She looked at Zuri. "He's gone?" she said. "He's gone." Neri absorbed that. Something in her face worked briefly, muscles in her jaw, a tightening around her eyes. And then it settled into something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite grief, but existed in the territory between them. "Come in," she said. The West Room was tidier than Zuri had expected, or perhaps Nari had tidied it deliberately as a form of control in the last few hours, the way people straightened objects when they couldn't straighten circumstances. They sat, not at the formal sitting area, but on the low bench near the window, the same configuration Zuri seemed to keep finding herself in with women in this house. Side by side, not face to face, looking at something other than each other. "What happened in the study?" Nari said. "Not a question exactly." "Your father agreed to dissolve the arrangement." The silence that followed was very specific. Not surprise. Nari had known something had shifted when her father came out and called for his car, without speaking to her. But hearing it stated was different from inferring it, and the difference had a sound, which was this particular silence. "He'll say it was his decision," Nari said finally. "When he goes home, when he tells people, he'll have a version in which it was always his choice. He needs that." "I know," Zuri said. "He's not—" She stopped. "He's not a monster. I know what he is. I know all of it. I grew up watching all of it, and I know it completely, and I have never been able to make it simple, because he is also the man who sat with me for 4 hours when I was 12 years old and sick and scared. And he never left the room." Her hands were in her lap. "He just never asked me what I wanted. He never thought to. It didn't occur to him that asking was part of the job." Zuri said nothing. She let it exist. "I'm going to tell him," Nari said. The flatness was back in her voice, but it was a different flatness now. Not the managed composure of before, but the flatness of a decision that had been reached and was now simply being reported. "Not tonight. When I'm home. I'm going to tell him that I want to choose, that I want the option of someone who chooses me back." She looked at her hands. The ring was still there. "I don't know what that looks like yet. I've never been allowed to find out." "You'll find out," Zuri said. Nari looked at her. The skepticism in it was real. Not hostile, just real, the reasonable skepticism of someone who had been promised things before. "You believe that?" "I do." "Why?" Zuri thought about it. "Because you're the first person I've met since I landed who said a completely true thing without being asked to." She held Nari's eyes. "That doesn't go away. That's something you already have." Nari looked at her for a long moment. Then she reached to her left hand and slid the ring from her finger. She held it for a moment. Not with drama, not with ceremony, just looking at it with the plain attention of someone seeing an object for what it was rather than what it had represented. A small piece of shaped metal. Significant only because significance had been assigned to it by people with the power to make assignments stick. She set it on the windowsill. "I'll return it to his people tomorrow," she said. Zuri nodded. They sat for a while longer in the West Wing room, two women who had been placed in opposition by circumstances neither of them had designed, and found at the end of it that the opposition had never quite been the real thing between them. When Zuri left, Nari was still sitting at the window, not looking at the ring, looking past it, at the dark mountain outside, at whatever was on the other side of a life she was finally, at 26, beginning to refuse on its own terms. She found Taehyun in the courtyard, not sitting, standing near the edge of the walkway where she had sat every morning with her sketchbook, looking at the stones in the dark. The courtyard lights were low, and the mountain cold had settled into the stones and the garden with its old specific weight, and he looked like a man who had come here because it was the only place in this house where the architecture left him alone. She stood beside him. For a while neither of them spoke. The stone arrangement in the dark was different than in the morning light. Less precise, more felt. The spaces between the stones were harder to see and in some ways more present for the difficulty. Negative space becoming more itself in darkness, the way absences sometimes did. He agreed, Taehyun said finally. My father, it wasn't clean. It won't be clean for a while. There are business consequences. Some of the port agreements will need to be restructured. 2 of the shipping contracts will likely dissolve. He was looking at the stones. He told me he hoped I understood what I'd asked of him. What did you say? I told him I understood it and I was asking anyway. A pause. I told him that I was asking because I believed there was a version of this family that didn't require its children to be instruments of its continuity. I told him I wanted to build that version with him. His jaw was tight. He said he didn't know if he was capable of it. Is that the worst thing he could have said? No. The worst thing would have been to say yes too easily. Saying he didn't know, that was honest. He looked at her. He doesn't give honest answers when he already has a comfortable one available. The fact that he didn't have a comfortable one means something. She looked at his face in the courtyard dark. The carved-down quality was still there, but underneath it, something she hadn't seen since before the gate cameras had caught his father's vehicle. Something that was exhausted and present and alive in the way things were alive after surviving. What did Dong-suk want? She said. At the end, what was the thing he couldn't make your father agree to? Taehyun was quiet for a moment. He wanted a formal acknowledgement that the dissolution was Kang-initiated, that the breach of arrangement was our family's responsibility. It would have handed him a public position, the wronged party, strategic leverage. Your father refused. My father said the dissolution was mutual and final, and that any subsequent characterization of its cause was a private matter between 2 families who would handle it as such. He looked back at the stones. It was the right position. Dong-seok knows it was the right position. He agreed because the alternative was a public dispute that would have cost him more than the arrangement was worth. And the alliance itself? Gone. Whatever the next relationship between those organizations looks like, it won't be structured around a marriage. It won't be structured around my family's obligation. He paused. There will be consequences. There are already consequences. But they're consequences we can navigate, and we will navigate them, and in 5 years the landscape will look different enough that what was lost won't be the only available measure. Zuri nodded slowly. She thought about the 2 American investment groups. The Incheon Northern Basin. The survey data she'd loaded on her phone at 2 in the morning in the East Wing because she had known, even if she hadn't admitted it to herself fully, that the conversation she'd walked into that study for was one she'd been preparing for her whole professional life. Every room she'd had to walk into alone. Every proposal she'd rebuilt 4 times because nothing less than the right answer was acceptable. Every morning she'd shown up knowing she was the youngest, the only, or both. All of it, she realized now, had been practice for this specific room, not because she'd been destined for it. She didn't believe in destiny. She believed in preparation and attention and showing up. But because the accumulation of those rooms had made her someone who could stand in this one and not be moved. I need to ask you something, she said. He looked at her. What you said, in the sitting room, before everything. She held his eyes. That you chose me because I make you want to build things instead of control them. She paused. Did you mean that? Not as something beautiful to say. Did you actually mean it? He didn't answer immediately. She had learned that about him in 14 months. That the pause before an answer was the quality control, not the hesitation. He was finding the accurate thing, not the comfortable one. Yes, he said. When I'm with you, I think about architecture, about what can be made, about permanence that isn't imposed. He looked at the stones. When I'm managing the other parts of my life, I think about security, about leverage, about the geometry of threat and counter-threat. He looked back at her. With you, I think about foundations. What they need to be built correctly so that what goes on top of them doesn't eventually destroy itself. She looked at the stones in the dark. Then let's build it correctly, she said. The morning came. Mountain light, the specific blue-gray of high altitude before the sun cleared the ridge. Zuri was in the courtyard before anyone else except the grandmother, who was already on her bench when Zuri arrived, and who looked at her with the eyes that had been measuring the world for 83 years and found most of it legible. The old woman said something. Zuri caught more of it than she would have a week ago. The Korean had been settling in her. the phrases organizing themselves into structures she could navigate. She caught stayed, and she caught showed them, and she caught a word she had to reach for and identified as something close to arrived. Not arrived as in traveling, but arrived as in become. Come into a thing fully. Take your shape inside it, she said in Korean, carefully. I don't know yet if I've arrived. I think I'm still becoming. The grandmother looked at her. Then she said something very short, 3 words, and pointed at the stone arrangement. Zuri looked at the stones, the 3 in the cluster she'd drawn wrong the first morning. The ones where she'd placed them too close together collapsed the space between them. She'd corrected the drawing, but the correction had only been in the sketch. She looked at the grandmother. The old woman made a small motion with her hand. Go on. Zuri stepped off the walkway and crouched in the cold, damp garden. The stones were heavy but movable, each one solid and water-smooth and exactly itself. She found the 3rd stone in the cluster and she moved it, slowly, the correct distance. Not by measurement, but by the felt sense of rightness that she trusted in buildings and trusted here. She stepped back. The arrangement was different now. The space between the 3 stones was exactly what it needed to be. Negative space, present and intentional. Not emptiness. Breath. The grandmother looked at the stones for a long time. Then she said something that Zuri didn't fully catch. A longer sentence, slower, as though the old woman was choosing to give her the full version rather than the approximation. Zuri stood in the garden and listened and assembled what she could and let the rest pass through without forcing it. What she caught was enough. Something about building. Something about how the hardest thing was not the weight you carried, but knowing where to set it down without losing what you'd learned from carrying it. Something about a woman who had come to this house 53 years ago without position or protection and had found that neither was the thing that mattered. Something that might have been, the strength was always yours. We just needed to see you use it. Zuri's throat closed. She breathed through it. She stepped back onto the walkway and sat beside the grandmother on the bench, and the old woman's hand found hers, dry and cool and absolute. And they sat together in the morning blue-gray and looked at the stones and did not need anything else said. Weeks passed. Nari returned to Seoul and had the conversation with her father she'd promised herself she would have. Zuri never knew the details. She didn't ask and Nari didn't share them, but she received a single message 3 weeks later. 2 sentences, no salutation, in English. I said the true thing. It cost what I expected and less than I feared. No signature. She didn't need one. The Incheon Northern Basin Engineering Review was reopened. Zuri's contact at the American investment firm flew to Seoul for a preliminary meeting with Kang Global Development's infrastructure team. It was preliminary, careful, exploratory, nothing signed, but it was real. And real was the only thing she'd ever promised. Taejun met with her twice more in the months that followed. Both times in his study, both times about the waterfront projects, both times with the same quality of engaged attention he'd shown the first time. He did not become warm. He was not a warm man, and she did not require him to be. But the meetings had the texture of partnership, 2 people with different expertise addressing a shared problem. And that was more than she'd walked into this house expecting. Suyeon texted her constantly. About everything and nothing. A vocabulary word she'd found funny, a television show she wanted to argue about, a photograph of the courtyard taken from her bedroom window at a particular angle that caught the stones in a light neither of them had seen from the walkway. You should see this, the caption said. I'm keeping this angle for you. Jisoo called her once, on a Tuesday evening in late November. She asked about the Chicago firm's current projects. She asked about the American investment timeline. Near the end of the call, briefly, she mentioned that she had spoken to a colleague who chaired an urban development foundation in Seoul and that the foundation was looking for an international consultant on 2 specific projects. She did not say, I thought of you. She did not say, I am doing this for my son. She said, I mentioned your work. They were interested. I thought you should know. It was Jisoo's version of welcome, and Zuri received it exactly as such. But the wedding was in spring, not the wedding anyone in that house had expected 6 months earlier. Not the formal alliance, not the ceremony of 2 organizations expressing their merger in white and ceremony. Something smaller and harder won, and more actual than that. The estate's outer garden, the one that faced the sea when you went far enough along the mountain path to where the trees broke and the cliff edge gave way to open water. A family gathering, the grandmother in her traditional dress, Su Yan crying with the magnificent incoherence of someone who had decided not to be embarrassed about it. Ji Su standing with her back straight and her eyes bright and her composure present but not weaponized against the moment. Taejun stood beside his son. He looked, for the first time since Zuri had known him, like a man who was not managing a situation. Just a man standing in a place he'd built and looking at the thing his son had become and taking the measure of it without the weight of what it had cost on his face. The cost was there. It would always be there. Paid debts didn't disappear. They just stopped accruing. But it wasn't the dominant thing. Not today. He had said to her the week before in the study, at the end of their third meeting, "My son has good judgment." He had said it while looking at the Incheon survey data on his desk, not at her, and his voice was casual in the careful way of someone making a statement casual on purpose. "He always has. I did not always trust it." She had said, "He learned it from watching you." Taejun had looked up at that, found her eyes, held them for a moment. Then he'd looked back at the survey data and said, "The Phase 2 construction begins in April. I would like you involved in the foundation assessment." She had said yes. At the edge of the cliff, with the sea below them and the spring wind doing what spring wind did, Tae-hyun held her hands and said the things that people said in these moments. And she said hers back, and the grandmother watched from her chair that Soo-yeon had carried all the way along the mountain path because no one had suggested she stay behind and she hadn't offered to. It was not a perfect moment. Her father couldn't be there. The flight timing hadn't worked. He'd been there 3 days earlier and had stood in the courtyard with Tae-hyun for an hour, talking about structural engineering and Korean architecture. And when he'd left, he'd embraced his daughter and said quietly, "He sees you, baby girl." Her mother had cried twice before her flight and sent a voice message at midnight that Zuri had listened to 3 times. There were gaps in it, things missing. The distance and the cost and the strangeness of building a life somewhere that was still, in the daily textures of it, not entirely familiar. A language still being learned, a city still being mapped, a family whose particular frequencies she was still learning to read. But here was the thing about gaps. She knew this. She'd known it since she was 9 years old, looking at a Frank Lloyd Wright house in Oak Park and trying to understand why the spaces between the walls moved her more than the walls themselves. The gap was not the failure of the thing. The gap was the thing breathing. It was the space that let the structure be itself instead of a closed fist. You built around the gap. You built with it in mind. You made room for what wasn't there yet. Tae-hyun put the rings on her finger. Her ring, the one from the kitchen floor in Chicago. The one she'd worn through 5 days and 100 small reckonings and 1 corridor conversation with a man who'd arrived to demonstrate his power and had left without it. He said, "You stayed." She said, "I said I would." The sea below them was indifferent and enormous and entirely itself, and the wind moved through the cliff grass with the patient sound of a thing that would be here long after all of them. And Kang Tae-hyun looked at the woman he had asked to cross an ocean and find her footing in a house that had not been ready for her. And she looked back at him with the clear eyes of someone who had walked through every room in that house and recognized, now, all the load-bearing walls. It was not a story about how love conquered anything. It was a story about 2 people who had chosen each other with full knowledge of the cost and had paid it, and had found on the other side of paying it that what they'd built had the kind of foundation that didn't require the illusion of easy ground. The grandmother watched from her chair. She said nothing. She had said what she needed to say months ago in a language Zuri had been in the middle of learning. She had said, "The strength was always yours." And now, here, with the sea and the wind and the family around them, you could see that it was true.